The Georgia sun clung to the skin like syrup that summer, thick and heavy, the kind that makes your lungs feel like they're breathing through velvet. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories. In the quiet town of Willowford, nestled behind wrought iron gates and sycamore trees, the Carrington estate loomed like something out of a fading photograph, majestic, untouched by time, and guarded by wealth old enough to forget where it came from. Inside those gates, a woman named Marilyn Porter walked with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a silence that had learned to endure. 49 years old, no children, no husband, just a small apartment above a thrift store and memories that sometimes played tunes in her dreams. She hadn't always cleaned houses. Once, long ago, she had other plans, ones with melodies and grand stages. But life rerouted her gently, without cruelty, just certainty. Bills piled up, a medical emergency here, a job layoff there. And eventually, she learned to let go of music the way some people let go of summer, with regret but understanding. When the Hollingsworth agency called her about a position, she barely waited for the woman on the phone to finish. Private estate, good pay, regular hours. Marilyn said yes with practiced calm. The Carringtons were the kind of family you read about in business journals or architectural digests. Old Southern aristocracy, white-columned porch, a fleet of gardeners, weekly deliveries from European markets. When Marilyn arrived at 717 Wexler Avenue, the door was opened by the house manager, Ms. Devereux, a thin-lipped woman with a clipboard and eyes like measuring tape. "You're on time," she said without looking up. "That already makes you better than the last one." Marilyn didn't flinch. She never did. In her line of work, dignity was often a quiet rebellion. For weeks, she moved like air through the house, scrubbing, folding, polishing. She memorized the rhythms. When Mr. Carrington left for the club, when Mrs. Carrington returned from her charity lunches, when the wine cellar was restocked, and which guest rooms were rarely used but always pristine. Mr. Theodore Carrington was a man who filled a room before entering it. Tall, impeccably dressed, the sort of Southern man who used charm like a scalpel. People didn't say no to him, not because they feared him, but because they didn't want to. And Marilyn, she made sure to stay invisible. Until one day, she didn't. The music room was always closed. No one used it anymore. The grand piano sat beneath a dustless velvet cover, like a relic. But one afternoon, as Marilyn dusted the corridor, the door had been left ajar. She stepped inside, just for a moment. The light hit the keys like a stage. Her hand twitched. She hadn't played in nearly 2 decades. Her mother's hymns, her own compositions, all packed away in silence. She sat, just for a breath. One note, then another. Then, music. Faint, soft, a lullaby from childhood, something barely remembered but deeply known. She didn't hear Mr. Carrington step inside. "That's not part of your duties," he said coolly, a glass of Merlot balanced in his palm. Marilyn rose quickly. "I apologize, sir." "You play?" he asked, eyebrows arched. She didn't respond. Didn't need to. His smirk was more curious than cruel. "Hot," he said, then turned and walked away. 2 weeks later, the estate transformed overnight. Tents, imported flowers, a jazz band from Charleston, the annual Carrington Gala, a spectacle of silk and applause. Marilyn didn't expect to be noticed. She was staff, background, polished silver and cucumber water. But Carrington had plans. Just after sunset, as champagne flutes were raised and the music paused, he called out from the marble steps, "Ladies and gentlemen, before dinner, a surprise." Marilyn froze behind the bar. "I've discovered a gem among our humble staff," he said. "A hidden talent." Eyes turned. "I invite our very own Marilyn Porter to delight us with a bit of unexpected entertainment." Laughter. A few claps. Polite curiosity. She didn't move. "Come now," he added, smiling with teeth. Don't be shy." She could have said no, could have walked away, but something in her chest pushed forward, a whisper from the past, a hand on her shoulder that wasn't there but still felt real. She nodded once, walked toward the music room, sat down, and played. The room changed the moment she sat down. Marilyn Porter didn't lift her hands right away. She stared at the keys as if reading something no one else could see, memories engraved between ivory and ebony. The guests gathered, some still holding flutes of champagne mid-sip, others murmuring with that familiar cocktail of amusement and condescension reserved for help with hobbies. Mr. Carrington leaned against the doorway, still sipping, still smug. Marilyn closed her eyes. And then she played. Not a showpiece, not a classical waltz, not even jazz. She played Wind Beneath My Skin, a piece she'd written when she was 22, sitting on the edge of her mother's hospital bed in a cracked vinyl chair, back when hope was measured in hours. The opening notes were delicate, fragile as a confession. Each keystroke whispered rather than announced. The room fell quiet. Not polite quiet, awestruck quiet. Something shifted. The buzz of chatter dissolved. Even the clink of ice in a glass stopped. Time, somehow, slowed. She didn't look at the crowd. She wasn't playing for them. She wasn't even playing for Carrington. She was playing because somewhere deep inside her chest, something had gone still years ago. And now, it stirred. Minor chords melted into aching harmonies. Blues brushed the edges of gospel. The melody curved upward, then dropped, like a sob held too long. And in the silence that followed, people forgot they were standing on Carrington marble, forgot their name tags and linen suits, forgot the woman before them had been folding napkins just an hour earlier. Marilyn played with grace, not grandeur, with truth, not performance. And that truth filled the room like a tide. A woman in the back gasped softly, her hand to her chest. The bandleader, an older man named Otis, lowered his trumpet, watched with wide eyes. Someone whispered, "She's playing like she's lived every note." But Marilyn heard none of it. Her fingers knew where to go. Her body remembered more than she thought it could. And when the last note faded, when her hands finally stilled, there was silence again. Not empty. Full. Then one clap. Slow. Steady. Then another. Then the room rose, not in politeness, but instinct. They weren't applauding a maid. They were applauding a miracle they didn't know they'd needed. Carrington. He hadn't moved. But the smirk was gone, replaced by something colder. Confused. Threatened. Marilyn stood, her hands trembling slightly. She nodded, not to the crowd, but to the music, to the part of herself she'd buried for 2 decades. She turned to leave, eyes low. But she didn't make it 5 steps before a tall woman in a velvet green dress intercepted her. You didn't learn that in a kitchen. It was Eleanor Vance, the chair of the South Georgia Arts Council. Marilyn shook her head. "No, Mom." "Where'd you study?" "I didn't. Not formally." Eleanor blinked. "Then I just witnessed something even rarer than talent. I witnessed truth." Before Marilyn could reply, others swarmed. A retired symphony conductor asked for her contact. A music school rep offered to talk funding. A journalist requested an interview. One man even offered to sponsor a recital. Marilyn's eyes darted past them, to Carrington. He hadn't moved, but his jaw had tightened, his wine untouched, his plan unraveled. She met his gaze, held it, and for the first time, he looked away. Later that night, when the crowd dispersed and the music resumed, Marilyn found herself alone in the pantry, gripping a paper cup of water. Her hands had steadied, but her chest hadn't. Mrs. Lyle, the cook, peeked in. "You all right, honey?" Marilyn nodded, voice soft. "I didn't mean to. Steal the night." Mrs. Lyle chuckled. "Steal? Baby, you returned what was always yours." Then came Carrington. He entered like a storm disguised in silk. She didn't flinch. "You played beautifully," he said, measured. "They loved it." She said nothing. "I was trying to give you a moment," he continued. "No," she said, her voice a breath of fire. "You were trying to mock me. You wanted applause that made you look generous. But they didn't clap for you, Mr. Carrington. They clapped for me." Silence. "You're lucky," he finally said. "This could have opened doors. It already has, just not the ones you own." And with that, she walked away. The following Monday morning, the Carrington house was unusually quiet. Marilyn showed up on time, as always. She polished the marble staircase, wiped down the tall windows that overlooked the garden, and folded the linen napkins into crisp triangles. No one mentioned the party. No one dared. But eyes followed her differently now. The same people who once let the door swing shut behind her now paused to hold it open. Even Ms. Devereux, clipboard queen of silence, gave her a nod. That was a first. But Marilyn Porter wasn't interested in nods, or glances, or new invitations. She had already made her decision. By mid-afternoon, she walked down the long hall to Mr. Carrington's office, a quiet room lined with old books and even older brandy. He looked up from a newspaper as she entered. She handed him a folded piece of paper. "My notice," she said simply. 2 weeks. Carrington stared at the letter like it was written in a language he didn't speak. "You're quitting." "I'm leaving," she corrected gently. "Why?" "Because of the music." "No," she said, "because I remembered who I was." Carrington stood slowly, brushing invisible lint from his jacket. "You know it," he said, almost casually. "They're all calling you now. These arts people, interviewers, sponsors. You're popular." "I'm not interested in popularity," she said. "I'm interested in peace." He scoffed softly. "You'll be back. You all come back." Marilyn stepped toward the door, then paused. "Maybe," she said, "but not to you." 2 weeks later, Marilyn Porter walked out of 717 Wexler Avenue for the final time. No farewell party. No gold watch. No applause. Just the creak of the front gate and the sun warming her face like a welcome home. She carried the same canvas bag she brought her first day. But everything else had changed. Back in her apartment, she unearthed a cardboard box from the back of her closet. Inside, yellowing sheet music, a cracked metronome, an old photo of her mother playing an upright piano, eyes closed, hands in motion. That night, she played until the neighbors knocked lightly on the wall. She played not for an audience, but for herself, for the girl she used to be, for the woman she was finally becoming again. A month later, she stood inside a small music room at the Willowford Community Arts Center, sunlight dancing across the floor, dust motes floating like notes in midair. She faced a group of 5 students, 3 kids, 2 women in their 50s, all nervous, all hopeful. Marilyn smiled. "First thing you need to know," she said, sitting at the piano, "is that this isn't about playing perfect. It's about remembering what lives inside you and learning how to let it speak." A girl named Tasha raised her hand. "Miss Marilyn, were you really a maid in that big fancy house?" Marilyn chuckled softly. "I was." "Did they make you play?" She paused. "No, sweetheart. They tried to make a fool out of me. I just chose to play instead." Tasha blinked, then smiled wide. "That's kinda badass." Marilyn laughed, a real full laugh. "Maybe it is." Word traveled through Willowford. Not fast, not loud, but steady. People talked about the woman from the Carrington party. Some said she stunned 100 guests into silence. Others said she embarrassed Carrington so badly he stopped hosting parties for a while. But Marilyn didn't care for rumors. She cared about lessons, and music, and healing. She began giving workshops on weekends, played recitals for charity, composed new songs, pieces that blended pain, joy, resistance, and grace. She never mentioned Carrington, never needed to, Because her story wasn't about revenge. It was about remembrance, about reclaiming a gift no one else was allowed to define. One rainy evening, as she locked up the arts center, Marilyn stood for a moment under the awning, watching the raindrops fall. Behind her, the faint sound of a student still practicing echoed through the walls. Hesitant, imperfect, but honest. She closed her eyes and smiled. Some people wait their whole lives for a stage. Some never get it. Some are forced to perform for the wrong reasons. But a few, just a few, get to reclaim the stage on their own terms. And when they do, they don't just play music. They change the room. So if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told you were less than you are, remember Marilyn Porter. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need recognition. She only needed one moment to remind the world and herself that her worth was never up for debate. And when your moment comes, play it like it was always yours.